Our first speaker is going to be Alex Pollock, who comes here from Jerusalem. He's the director of the Microfinance Department at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. He's based in East Jerusalem, and in his role, he develops strategy, policy, business plans, and manages an operationally and financially self-sufficient microfinance department within UNRWA, which is not a small accomplishment, actually. This is the only multinational microfinance operation in the MENA region, with 430 staff, a headquarters office, 4 regional offices, 21 branch offices in the occupied Palestinian territories, Syria, and Jordan. The office is responsible for investments of $311 million through 270,000 microfinance enterprises, consumer, and housing loans. He's the one I mentioned earlier, who I think he just came back last week from Syria, right, Alex? Oh, here you are, yeah. The second speaker will be Alia Malek on the state and daily life and living conditions in Syria. She's a civil rights lawyer and journalist who has lived and worked in the US, Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank, and Italy. She's moved to Damascus in April 2011 and was last there in May 2013. She is the author of, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this book, A Country Called America, US History Retold Through Arab American Lives. And she's the editor of Patriot Acts, Narratives of the Post-9/11 Injustice. Her work has appeared in New York Times, The Nation, Foreign Policy Salon, Christian Science Monitor, Columbia Journalism Review, Granta, et cetera, et cetera. And she's a senior staff writer at Al Jazeera America. And the last speaker in this first panel is Bassam Haddad. Bassam is the director of Middle East Studies program and teaches in the Department of Public and International Affairs at George Mason University in Washington, D.C., and is a visiting professor at Georgetown University. And he's the author of the very well-received book, Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience. I think Bassam might want to change that title now after 2011. The situation he studied, which was really, I think, the first systematic study of business networks in Syria in relationship to political power, has been overtaken in many ways, and he was just telling me, by the enormously different situation that has come into existence in Syria today. But I'm sure what was there 3 years ago is still, in many ways, extremely relevant. So we're eager to hear about that. Bassam, that academic profile is, I would say, a small part of what he is, and besides being a DJ, to whose songs I've danced many a time. He is also the founder of several very important initiatives. One that doesn't get much recognition is this Journal of Arab Studies Journal, which is really one of 2 in the country that have the Arab world as unit of analysis. The Arab world does not exist in US Academy. We have Middle East and Islamic studies. We don't have Arab studies, unlike in Europe and elsewhere. The other journal was founded by Edward Said and Ibrahim Abu Lughod by AUG. And co-founder of Jadaliya, who many of you know of Tadween Publishing, and so on and so forth. And we're happy to have him here with us. So, may I invite Alex to come and begin, about 15 to 20 minutes each, 3 papers, and then we'll have the discussion by Glenn, and then open it up to the audience. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Bashar, and thank you to the Middle East Center for the invitation. The paper I'm going to be speaking to today is this paper, which I hope you may have had. If you don't have the paper, you can pick it up at www.unrwa.org. This is a paper that we're producing we're producing these reports on a quarterly basis on changes and macroeconomic indicators on the Syrian economy. This is the second report, and the data I'm talking to today goes up to the first half of this year. So when I'm presenting data, you may have heard of higher numbers because things are changing very rapidly on the ground, but the data I'm referring to is data at the mid-year point in 2013. I think I should like to preface my discussion, first of all, by saying a little bit much on a more personal and in terms of my work experience in Syria. And I want to say I've been working in Syria since 2003, but I don't live in Syria. I visit regularly and I employ 120 staff. I had 5 offices in Syria, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But we had the second largest microfinance program in Syria that was fully self-sustaining and was growing very rapidly before the conflict began. In fact, even after the conflict began in 2011, we still grew the portfolio in the first part of the year. Things really started to go wrong in Syria in mid-2012. That's when the economy started to implode. That's when we began to have different problems. And let me just explain the context in which we were working. Currently, about 20% of my staff have either resigned or taken long-term leave without pay. Some of them are residing in Lebanon. A few have gone to Gaza. A number are now living in Sweden, where they've entered as illegal migrants. We have the biggest part of our staff live in Yarmouk, which is an area of Damascus on the suburbs. All of the staff from Yarmouk have been displaced, many of them multiple times. Many of the staff have moved from living in nuclear family households to extended family households with their parents, their brothers and sisters, and their own children. So people have moved from households of 4 to 6 people into households of 24 to 30 people, and that's how my staff are surviving. And they're surviving. They're doing very well compared to other Syrians, as we'll see in the paper. But there's been massive job loss in the economy. Also, what's happened to our offices, I'll just explain, because we still have to run on a sustainable basis, no matter if the war's going on or not. My job as a manager is to create a business environment where we cover the costs of our operations and pay our staff. Since the start of the conflict, we had 4 offices in Damascus and 1 office in Aleppo. The 4 offices in Damascus were in Douma, which Sayda Zainab, Yarmouk, and Alamein. And we had another office in Aleppo and Bustan al-Basha. In Douma, basically we had to close it in June 2006. Douma was one of the first areas of Damascus where the opposition forces came to, and after a few months we had to close the office because there was continual attacks daily on the area. Following that, our office in Bustan al-Pasha became on the front line, and for a year we didn't see the condition of the office. We only recently managed to get to the office to see its condition. It's not been destroyed, but it has serious blast damage, so we cannot reconstitute the office in that area. The next in line was Sayda Zainab, which is the Shia area of Damascus. It's a pilgrimage area, and so lots of Iranians, lots of Iraqi Shia come to that area because this is where the shrine of the Prophet's mother is. That has also been closed. The office still stands, but it's been broken into. The safe has been robbed. Various other things. And Yarmouk, we had the worst damage in Yarmouk, and that came much later. In Yarmouk, our office was destroyed and looted by Jabhat al-Nusra, and it was very clearly stated in a way that the way in which the office was closed was quite frightening for our staff, because it was couched in terms of Islamic law of war, where the fighters had a right to loot buildings and take the resources as part of the reward they have for their jihad. And so that was the most frightening aspect of it. Also, we have had staff who've been kidnapped. We recently managed to release 1 staff member who was kidnapped. They started making demands of hundreds of thousands of dollars for him to be released. They then made demands the demands came down slowly over time, and he was released for about $12,000. When we released him in Aleppo, we then moved him to another part of the country. So as our offices closed in Aleppo, and as I said, we have to maintain a self-sufficient microfinance institution, we opened 3 new branch offices in Latakia, Tartus, and Sweda, which are parts of the country that are very strongly under government control. And there, the economy is still functioning. I won't say effectively, but it's still functioning. Contract law is still in process. So the normal business processes that allow a business to survive and, if not flourish, at least maintain itself are in place there. So that's the sort of context in which we are working with. Now, in terms of this report and what the data I'm going to talk about, in fact, I'm not going to talk very much about the data because there's too much data for me to go over. This goes into great detail on the macroeconomy, on fiscal aspects, on trade, and on exchange rates. So I don't want to go into all that information, but let me just start by saying a little bit about the project. This work we are doing in UNRWA, we were working with a group of young economists in Syria called the Syrian Center for Policy Research. They have worked, this is the second report they've done for us. They also done a large report in 2012 looking at the state of the Syrian economy. And so we hired them to continue to do this work, to look at the changing nature of the economy on a quarterly basis. So we've currently contracted them to the first quarter of 2014, and we'll probably contract them beyond that until 2015, since as Bashara had said earlier, this is a conflict that's not going to end very quickly. And so we plan to continue to monitor this situation for some time to come. Now, the data itself is done by it's done on a projection. It's done on a counterfactual methodology that basically takes the situation in 2010 and the period rising up to 2000 and projecting that as the normal state of the Syrian economy, where it would be today if the armed conflict had not happened. We also take the information that we have from this various statistical departments and financial and economic modelling. We project that to the situation as it is now. And the gap between the two periods is essentially what the Syrian economy has lost until today. So we look mainly at macroeconomic, national accounts, fiscal data, labour market data, and because we think that these indicators bring out the tragic consequences of the conflict in ways that are not normally studied by humanitarian agencies. So humanitarian agencies tend to focus on the tragedy, but not look at the economic causes of that tragedy. So we're trying to bring that out so that it allows humanitarians to have a stronger and better focus on and looking at how they do their work. Not just applying bandages or band-aids to problems, but to look to see how they can help people living in dire circumstances to create some forms of self-reliance and maintain some level of human development. Now, the reports we present provide a deep economic analysis of the trends, but we're not doing this for its own sake. But rather, we want to show how the economic circumstances have impacted on the lives, livelihoods, human development, and humanity of the Syrian people. And I think it's very important that we focus on the Syrian people, because a lot of the discussion that we face on this really doesn't discuss the Syrian people. They discuss the various warring parties, their interests, but no one really looks very much at what's happening to Syrian people and what their needs are. And that goes for both parties. Even in the party themselves don't spend much time focusing on what the needs of the people are. So insofar as it's possible within such an emotionally charged drama, we have endeavoured to present the information and data in an objective and independent manner, while knowing that no research of this kind can be value-free. This is just a simple reality of the situation. However, and again, contrary to many commentators, and again, reinforcing what Bashara has said earlier, this is not a Manichaean struggle, right? This is not between good and evil. It's not between good guys and bad guys. It's not even a Smithian struggle between friends and enemies, our guys and their guys. The truth be told, there's an abundance of badness on both sides, who have each engaged in barbarous acts and each side is serially in breach of international law and international humanitarian law, with few acts of reparation or goodness on either side. I think that has to be recognized. And if I may quote from Gil Scott-Heron, contrary to his view of the world, in Syria, the revolution has been televised, and people are able to plug in, turn on, and cop out, and also engage in the skag and the skip. And that's but the question is it a revolution? Or is it even an eventual situation in the sense of Alain Baidu would give to the situation? As the ruptures and modes of being, according to Baidu, the part of the eventual process, as the transformation of subjectivities, as the engendering of fidelities. Despite such elements of an eventual nexus in the Baiduian sense, being present among all sides, perhaps the strongest in that sense belongs on the jihadist side. They have the ones who have the clearest, most concrete vision of what they're doing, whereas the other two parties to the side seem not to have the ability to come together or to talk with each other in any way. And from the political economy side, the armed conflict in Syria is a catastrophic event. It's not a revolutionary event. The situation is such that there will soon be little left to bargain with in the future, and any future peace settlement. Economically, the armed conflict in Syria has been a war on development and economic well-being. It has unbalanced the economy through a rapid process of deindustrialization, from which it will take the Syrian economy decades to recover. Since March 2011, the economy has lost the equivalent of $103 billion US, which is equivalent to 174% of GDP in 2010. The primary productive sectors and value-adding sectors of the economy, mining and petroleum, manufacture, construction, internal trade, transport and communications, finance and real estate, are in massive recession. The only exception to this is agriculture, with its share of the GDP doubling from 27% in 2010 to 54% in the second half of this year. This is not a positive development. While agriculture provides jobs for tens of thousands, even millions of people, it has risen as the value of its GDP has fallen. So although it's increased an increasing share of the GDP of the country, its actual value has fallen below what it was previously. This indicates a degenerative restructuring of the economy under forces of recession, which are driven by various factors. Apart from agriculture, the only growth poles in the economy are government, social, and NGO services, all of which are focusing on providing services within the humanitarian tragedy. But like the agricultural sector, these services have assumed a larger share of GDP, but their value has continued to shrink. The only exception to this is NGO services, which have grown, but the value of the NGO services are so minimal they don't really make a dent on the GDP level. So the NGOs have grown absolutely and relatively in terms, but they really they're not putting enough into the economy to make much of a difference. They help people in real need, but they don't really transform their lives, and they don't take them out of poverty. Most damaging for the future of the Syrian economy has been the damage to capital stock, which at just under 50 billion accounts for 48% of the economic losses that have happened over the past 27 months. So what we have is an increasing hollowing out of the wealth of the Syrian economy in both the private and public sphere. The hollowing out is partly a result of the flight of capital, as many businesses who have been able have moved elsewhere. They've taken their businesses offshore to Egypt, to Turkey. Some have moved internally from Aleppo, for example, which is one of the strongest business communities in Syria, to Latakia. But there's also massive bankruptcy and business closure. But also, one of the big factors in this has been wide-scale looting, theft, and destruction. I mean, malicious damage to economic resources for short-term gain, without any view to how the needs of the future of the economy. There has been an increase in rise in the economics and economies of violence, where racketeering, extortion, smuggling, and criminality encroach on legitimate business communities and endanger the welfare of ordinary business folk. Often businesses now have to operate in a realm where there's lawlessness, contract law is not there, police are not there, courts are not operating. And to run an economy in a legitimate manner, you need all the instruments of contract law, legality. These are all falling apart, and new groups of people are emerging with new wealth that's coming from sources that are essentially criminal in nature. Moreover, as the economy is shrinking, it is no longer able to meet the basic needs of the Syrian people. And again, this relates to a question that Bashara said, there's an increase in loss of sovereignty with the state and among the people. The cost of doing business is increasing as a result of scarcity caused by the international boycott and rising prices of all inputs for all sectors. So even those businesses that are managing to survive are having to pay greater costs for doing business. And that means they're putting up prices to consumers, so commodities are rising as well. The reduction and there's been a huge reduction in domestic supply that has reduced the incomes of all Syrian households. They no longer have the means to consume at pre-conflict levels. Private consumption contracted by 19% in 2012, and by 40% in the first quarter of 2013, and 47% in the second quarter compared to the same period in 2012. So you can see already that contraction is having a big impact on the livelihoods of people. The budget deficit has grown significantly, reaching 73% of GDP in the first half of 2013. And this has been forced upward by the need to increase external borrowing, mainly from allies, Iran and Russia. And while that's been going on, the government expenditure on public consumption, which is vital to mitigate the drop in demand, is falling. Public revenues from taxes and state enterprises, which were quite a large part of the Syrian economy, are now in decline. This has been affected by, combined with increasing costs of subsidies, so the governments have to pay more to subsidies for basic foodstuff, agricultural commodities, to ordinary people to help them provide a living. But the government's now in major crisis over that. And also there's been significant reallocation of the national budget for military purposes. So this has resulted in a contraction of public consumption by 12% in 2012, 23% in quarter one, and 22% in quarter two compared to 2012. Also, the economy is increasingly marked by informality. People have lost jobs, and people are engaged in small trading businesses, small crafts businesses, merely as a survival mechanism. It's not providing a decent standard of living. It's not allowing people to live effectively. And with informality, there's an increase in aspect of rent-seeking activity, particularly because of the massive number of displaced. Many people are now having to rent properties that they didn't before. So there's been a lot of landlordism, raising costs of rent, together with criminal enterprise and the economics of violence. And all of these factors will continue to plague the Syrian economy in the future as it tries to reform itself, introduce new regulation, and bring back some basic level of equity and development into the economy. This is going to be this is going to be a constant struggle that people have to think about for the future. Unfortunately, that does not seem to be part of the thinking currently. Together with these negative economic indicators, the armed conflict has exacted punitive socioeconomic harm on all Syrians. Refugees from Syria are now the fastest growing refugee population in the world, and by the end of this year, they will become the world's largest refugee population, overtaking Afghanistan at 2.3 million people. By the first half of 2013, the population had been hollowed out by over 8%, and more than a third of the population, 37%, had left their normal place of residence, with 1.73 million refugees at June this year. In addition to that, there was another 1.4 million people left Syria as migrants, traveling to other countries for employment, or that trend has reduced because the numbers migrating have gone because people no longer have the finances and resources to migrate. And there's another 5 million persons being internally displaced within Syria, often in numerous occasions. So between half to two-thirds of the population now live in poverty, with almost 8 million people becoming poor since the conflict began, and some 4.4 million of those living in deep poverty and no longer able to meet the basic needs of their families. Their situation has been worsened by rising prices for basic commodities, with consumer price index expected to increase threefold since the start of the conflict till the end of this year. The cost of electricity, gas, fuel has increased by over 300% since 2011, and the cost of all foodstuffs, clothing and shoes has increased by over 200%. Such price increases are pitching people in public service and people on fixed incomes into poverty even while they continue to work. It's much worse for those who have been displaced and lost their employment, but even many working people are now living in poverty. The devastation of the economy has resulted in the loss of 2.33 million jobs, and led to hardship for almost 10 million people who are dependent upon those jobs for their livelihood, to live. So that's almost half the population have been affected by job loss. Amidst this general economic collapse, 48.6% of the workforce was unemployed by the second half of the year. That was a slight decline from the first quarter of the year, where it was above 50%. The reason for that is it was the peak of the agricultural season came in the second quarter of the year, so that there was a pickup of employment for a period as people moved into agriculture for short-term employment. The expectation is that the unemployment rate will rise to above 50% in the third quarter of this year. In terms of the Human Development Index, Syria has already lost 21% of where it was in 2010, pushing back human development, which has been accompanied by an appalling lack of human security and a dramatic deterioration in equity and equality. Two sectors, I'll go very quickly over this. Education is in the midst of a silent disaster. Almost half of all school-aged children are no longer being formally educated. The education system has lost almost 3,000 schools as a result of damage and destruction, while another almost 700 provide shelter for internally displaced people. There is a significant shortage of teachers, as thousands have joined the throng of refugees and displaced people, and those teachers who are attending school often attend irregularly and erratically due to the conflict itself. The health system is also facing significant collapse. doctor population ratios have fallen from 1 doctor to 661 people to 1 doctor to 4,000, indicating there's been a huge brain drain in the midst of this crisis. Some 57 public hospitals are damaged, and 37 of them, 41%, are out of service. 31% of all public hospitals, 41% of all public hospitals are out of service. The almost 600 primary care centres, which are the main source of medicines and treatment for the chronically ill, are affected. Some 359 centres are out of service, 203 are unsafe, and 31 are damaged. Women and newborn babies are particularly at risk from the drop in attended deliveries and the lack of access to pre- and postnatal services, while children are facing low vaccination rates, reduced nutritional status, and increased incidence of infectious and other diseases. One of the most dramatic aspects of the conflict in Syria is the horrendous appalling loss of life. Conflict-related deaths grew by 67% in the first half of 2013, with an estimated 100,000 deaths over the course of the conflict. It's estimated another 400,000 people, including women and children, have been maimed and injured during the conflict. Thus, effectively, more than 2% of the Syrian population has been killed, maimed, or wounded in this conflict. Amidst such violence, there is an absence of human dignity and rights, with an often willful disregard for humanity among many of the combatants. I think I'll leave it there. I think. Thanks very much.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be here. I just flew in from Doha, so forgive me if I just fall asleep right standing up, but I will try not to. So I'm probably going to be the most different speaker here today. I'm not an academic, much to my parents' chagrin. I'm a journalist, and my experience is very different, so, hopefully security won't drag me out of here for doing something so dramatically different. Basically, I moved to Damascus in April 2011. I was always sort of looking for an opportunity to do a Syria book project, but the market was never going to be right, so in fact, I'd already started working on something about black farmers, and then the Arab Spring happened, so I dropped everything, put everything in storage, and moved to Damascus in April of 2011. Timing obviously seemed right. And back then it was still, as risky as it was to be a journalist in Syria at that time, it was still a manageable risk. The regime had sort of learned a lesson from Egypt that, apparently the way to stop a revolution is not to let the press in, not to, to close off all the roads that lead to public spaces where people could gather on Friday afternoons, and to shut the internet off on Thursday night, and to limit your access to certain sites. So, so in April of 2011, that was all that it really, those were the risks that were sort of in front of me. And so at the time, I have family in Syria. They took to sort of not mentioning the whole journalist part and just always introducing me as a lawyer, which I think anyway is probably less embarrassing in certain Arab social milieus. And it was a good time also potentially for journalism. I was there with many of my colleagues and mentors, including people like Anthony Shadid, and Karim Fahim was there, like a whole new cadre of us Arab American journalists, or journalists who understand the region, spoke Arabic, and had already affected the coverage that was coming out of Egypt, because it was sort of a more contextual understanding of those places. And it was even though we knew that the Assad regime had a history of brutality. I definitely did not foresee where it would go and where we would end up. Obviously things didn't remain that way, and in addition to all the activists and the people that were risking their life in the demonstrations becoming targets, so did journalists. Journalists became targets, and they started to be picked off, including people like my good friend and mentor Anthony. shadid. But yet, despite that, people continue to take risks to cross into Syria and to try to produce journalism. But it's what I call peephole journalism. It was like looking at all of Syria through a very, very small hole, and that's why a lot of the narratives that we saw coming out of there were sort of focused on the bang bang and rendered a lot of the other narratives invisible. And I think that's in part what has what we can attribute to such bad policy and bad understandings of the Syria conflict. This sort of reduction of it to a sectarian, to seeing it through a sectarian lens right away, and not understanding that even if that's where maybe things have gone, it's not where it began. And I think journalists contributed to this, sort of contributed to why we've seen very ineffective policy coming out. Now, working from the inside, I tried to counterbalance that. I wrote anonymously for the New York Times while I was in Damascus, including a front page story on an underground aid network, which I thought sort of really was a way to sort of show to return agency to the Syrian people and not to make them seem either as refugees or victims of violent opposition groups, but a way to sort of show how people were working very hard against the fragmentation of Syria. And I thought, because that was one of the things that I became very obsessed with, what was missing from the mainstream narrative was this sort of massive loss of Syria and what was at stake here, other than just whether it was ISIS or what the Mu'arad or the opposition was doing in a hotel in Istanbul or what the regime was doing. There was sort of like this missing component that was obviously is very compelling to me. And being on the inside, I saw that all much more closely, and it was very excruciating because, sort of as a journalist and also my former life as a human rights attorney, you sort of arrived to places after. I'd arrived to Lebanon after the war. I arrived to Palestine after dispossession and occupation, and to instead sort of watch the disintegration of a society in real time has led me to believe that it really can happen anywhere. Not that I'm praying for that or betting on that. And this was sort of what I talked about in the Sunday Review piece I did for the New York Times this summer, the Syria the World Forgot, and which is why I think I got invited to this, to talk to you. And so I did a lot of other work. I went to Tartus and Alia. I wrote a piece in the hills of Alawistan, and I crossed over from the Turkish side and did go see the internally displaced persons camp, the very big, and the way the life is in northern Syria. And I also went to Armenia, which to set up what I'm going to do now. I went to Armenia to sort of follow the fragmentation of Syrian society, and that piece was in the New York Times also last year. But just a few weeks ago, a piece came out from a long-form narrative take that I did on the story. It's called "Enduring Exile," and it's gotten a lot of play and a lot of social media love. And I'm going to read from it, which I imagine has never happened in a poli-sci conference. But this is, Middle East Studies Geniuses Conference. Okay. Okay. So. This is sort of a way to, this is the kind of work that I do as a way to sort of capture for other people what is at stake in Syria. I'm not going to read the entire piece. I encourage you to read it because it's genius. But because I think it's not peephole journalism, even though it's a very tight, closely focused story on one family and one situation. I actually think you see a lot more about Syria here. And so for those of you who know anything about Aleppo was, after the Armenian genocide in Turkey and the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, what was able to survive of Western Armenia survived in Syria. And so this is why I wanted to do this story, because it's a way to sort of also counter the Syria that now exists in the popular consciousness, especially because everyone's becomes an expert, has come to Syria only in the last few years. And I wanted to contrast this place of refuge and rebirth with this place that we are seeing now. And also I wanted to try to dissect the architecture of how sectarianism and civil conflict begins. So I won't be able to see if you guys are sleeping as I read. But so this is from a piece called "Enduring Exile," and there was a picture, but we don't have to put it up unless I do this and it does something. It's not doing anything. Maybe it is. It's just, I have to put it in. Okay, we don't need to do it, it's just a picture. So 2 years ago in September, Anto's neighbors warned him it was time for him to go. He would no longer be safe in these hills above the city of Idlib in northwestern Syria. He knew better than to doubt them. A descendant of Armenians from Ottoman Turkey had inherited a dormant vigilance that now awoke. Anto's father used to tell him, repeating what had been passed down through 4 generations, like we came from Turkey, we may also one day leave from Syria. With his neighbor's warnings in his ears, Anto scrambled to secure some cash. He started to quietly sell off whatever he could from Abu Artin, a restaurant inn that his family had operated every spring and summer since 1938. His grandfather had built Abu Artin, named for Anto's great-grandfather, high in these hills as an escape for Syrians living in the swelter of those months in the cities and towns below. The land offered fresh air, their kitchen delectable food, and the men, Anto and his father and grandfather before him, impromptu musical performances that had made them famous with customers. Anto sold the restaurant's cutlery and dishware and the inn's AC and heating units in another village and at a fraction of their value. Sentimental items, the portrait of his grandfather and father, he took to his house in Aleppo, where he lived in the off-season. He made sure not to tell anyone in the hills when he was coming or going. Even though he tried downsizing as slowly and as inconspicuously as possible, soon people began to notice, to circle, and to ask. Syrians were accustomed to the peering eyes of the government's many informers and generally understood the difference between what information could get someone in trouble and what just accumulated. But now, in the chaos that had been building in a speedy crescendo since spring, no one knew what detail would be damning and to which fate. January and February had brought an end to the dictatorships in Tunisia and Egypt. By March, it was clear that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who had inherited power from his father, bringing Assad family rule to a total of 41 years, did not intend to follow suit. At the end of the month, his forces had killed 103 unarmed protesting civilians and had disappeared many more. The exact number no one would ever quite know. So in April 2011, when Anto would have usually opened Abu Artin, he kept it shuttered instead. No one was driving the 70 kilometers from Aleppo, Syria's largest city and home to much of the family's clientele over the last 73 years. Syrians, still untouched by the violence in cities like Aleppo, were staying closer to home, hoping that by ignoring the war in other parts of the country, it might just go away. With summer, fruit had ripened, uneaten on the trees in the surrounding garden. Both restaurant and inn remained idle and empty. But by September, 6 months into the uprising and crackdown, no one could avoid a certain vulgar calculus. Anto was marked, a Syrian-Armenian Christian in a Syria of looming sectarianism. Aleppo was home to tens of thousands of other Syrian Armenians, but in these hills, Anto was alone. "You're like an Arab in Tel Aviv," a man from Idlib told him. Idlib and the surrounding area were becoming strongholds for opposition fighters, both secularists and jihadists. In the growing chaos, religion and ethnicity had become a congenital liability. The wrong belief or background at the wrong moment could be fatal. Guilt had become collective. One individual could be traded for another of the same sect or community in escalating cycles of brutality and vengeance. To the more conservative people in the hills, Anto was already an affront, with the alcohol serving, singing, and gender mixing in his restaurant. For the more ignorant, his being neither Muslim nor Arab, despite his being Syrian, made him fair game as a scapegoat for a regime that claimed to be supported by minorities. It also made him an easy target for kidnappers hoping to net a pretty ransom without the risk of angering a much more numerous or powerful community. For those who, in their fervor, believed a better Syria required that everyone be the same, there would be little room for him. Pragmatic Syrians reasoned that the casualties would be many before anyone would stop to consider or even question the hell that they had just meted upon each other. Anto had little time to waste and didn't want to gamble on the hope that people might come back to their senses. On an early morning in October 2011, a month after his neighbors warned him he would not be safe, Anto went up to the hills. One of the locals joked, "Why didn't you tell us you were coming? We were going to kidnap you." Anto laughed it off, but didn't say he had come for the last time. He silently bid goodbye to the trees, the hills, the ground itself. He nodded to the statue of the Madonna and the little masjid he had built so Muslim workers or guests could pray. He paused at the chair where he used to sit with his argila and gazed at the spot where, as a boy and as a man, he watched his father and grandfather sing to the rapt diners. He caressed the walls his great-grandfather had built from the stones turned up in the dirt all those years ago. This was history. It was real and couldn't be erased. Abu Artin was there before Bashar, before Hafez, before all the presidents. He fed the stray dog they had taken in and went into a small room and cried. He wanted to die. He thought his heart might stop of his own will right there. Where am I going to go? How am I going to take care of Matilda and the girls? He dried his tears and went to Mahmoud, who had worked for his family for years, who had held Anto's father's hand in the hospital when he died. Mahmoud now had a little dukkan, a convenience store close to Abu Artin. Anto asked Mahmoud to try to spare some food for the dog each day. He then handed him the keys to Abu Artin and told him he was returning to Aleppo. Anto kissed Mahmoud and said, "May God protect you. God willing, we will see each other again." "Don't come back, Muallim," Mahmoud said. A week later, Mahmoud told Anto over the phone that the door to the inn had been broken. What Anto had left behind, toilets, vanities, mirrors, had all been stolen by some neighbors. Displaced Syrians from Jisr had also moved into the emptying rooms. Anto cursed the thieves but didn't begrudge the squatters. They needed a place to sleep. They were escaping violence that had claimed their only homes. Where else should they go? Anto, his wife, and his 3 young children all had a place to sleep, even if he wasn't sure what would come next, what he would do, how he would provide. But he would figure it out. He had saved enough and sold enough that for the next several months they could survive, as their ancestors had before them, in the safety of Aleppo. And then this story goes on into 3 more sections to sort of trace the second section traces all the way back their Armenian, their Ottoman history. The third section goes to Armenia right at the end of the Cold War, when Syria was sort of coming into the light and Armenia was literally a place of darkness. And the last section is in Yerevan, where many of the Syrian Armenians have sort of temporarily, they think, relocated to. That's just a little sample of how I've tried to sort of fill out the narrative of Syria. I will talk to you guys about whatever you want, but that's it for now. Okay?
Joking. Yeah. Okay. There we go. I am happy to be here. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to everyone who is involved in putting this together. Of course, principally Bshara Domani, who's an old friend. I knew him a long time ago. Not an old friend. And I hope that, coming third and speaking for about 15-20 minutes won't actually be too taxing. In fact, what I want to say most about is the kind of difficulty to talk about Syria from afar. I mean, the idea that you can do this today and assume that it's just like business as usual is problematic because of the lack of flow of information, as I will discuss. But in adhering to Syrian Ba'ath Party ethics, I will not let this stop me. I will speak for another 15 to 20 minutes, otherwise my hosts will feel duped. I will be speaking about the causes and dynamics of the Syrian stalemate as well as the information flow. I'll start with the information flow. The stalemate, well, I'll start generally with the information flow. I'll read so that I can keep to my 20 minutes. The stalemate in Syria refers not only to the stalemate between the regime and all the social forces or political forces on the ground, but also among these forces themselves. It also extends to the regional and international sphere, where we are seeing less movement, less change, and with the local setting, a lot more re-entrenchment. A false business as usual sense has set in. In fact, gradually, Syria developments are no longer dominating the headlines on an almost daily basis, though they still figure somewhere there rather consistently. We are witnessing the formation of an entirely new context in various settings. Therefore, we must adjust our gaze and expectations. When I used to write about Syria during the first 2 years of the uprising, I used to always remark that so many of those who write or opine on Syria seem to take March 2011 as the starting point for analysis, and thereby jettison the impact of fundamental state society legacies of the prior 40 and 50 years which animate everything we are witnessing, at least until maybe the past year. Thus, analysis and arguments remain inadequate and abridged and end up being overrun by events, usually because they discounted the past. In my work, I tried to heed my own advice and focused equally on the pre- and post-uprising period to make any judgments at all. That is, the more you know about the past, the more you'll understand the present Syrian quagmire. Though I believe this is still the case for any broad analysis of developments in Syria, I am increasingly faced with a different and sometimes the opposite problem. As time goes by and as earlier structures, relations, and strategic positions give way to new forms and configurations, I am finding that knowledge about the past is growing less and less relevant by the year. In fact, without having one's hand on the pulse inside Syria, and in every major corner at that, much of our analysis will grow more abstract and divorced from the realities on the ground, including mine. And then it dawned on me, what is happening in Syria today in terms of retrenchment, and part of the reason why we don't hear as much about developments there, is almost a mirror of the realization that a new reality is setting in, one that carries new features, new contours, new relations dynamics, new strategic context, and even whole new players. Can I or other analysts pretend to be talking about the Syria we once knew? More than that, even if you live in Damascus, can you speak with substantially more authority about Raqqa and Idlib and other corners of Syria than a careful and connected observer outside Syria? Surely not necessarily, and not in both cases. And this I know from being in contact with people in these areas. And yet, even if I follow, or even if you follow the new, even if one follows the news in the provinces and all the essential social media reporting from various parts of the country, one will fail to draw a complete picture, as the news one hears and reads about is seldom corroborated in a solid manner. Does that mean that we should give in to this dearth of information? Before I try to answer the question, I would like to say something about the flow of information today. This is now much worse than a blackout that we used to have early on, because in a blackout of information, you know there is one major source causing the blackout, and one can infer reasons and interpret what little information comes out as a function of this one central force and dynamic. Today, multiplicity of power centers compounds the problem irretrievably. According to Charles Lister in Foreign Policy, I can't believe I'm quoting Foreign Policy, quote unquote, notwithstanding some speculation, Syria has become an intensely complex conflict. Militarily, the opposition currently consists of more than 1,000 armed opposition groups, as well as dozens of alliances, fronts, and joint operations rooms, and pro-government forces are similarly multidimensional. The battlefield, or the battle itself, is divided into countless kinetic theaters, each of which maintains its own unique characteristics, and few of which can be neatly replicated elsewhere. The ideological spectrum on both sides of the conflict has broadened and simultaneously intensified, and so on and so forth. Unquote. The good thing about such reports is that they are true to the extent that they enumerate the complexity that is more or less corroborated. However, most, not all, such reports remain incomplete and inadequate, as they don't or can't further unpack the complexity precisely because of the dearth of corroborated information. To go back to the question I mentioned about at the outset about giving in, I do not think we should despair completely. Instead, we should reduce our expectations as to veracity and soundness of analysis and take much of it with a grain of salt. Still, there is no substitute to not just historical grounding, but also to knowledge of regional relations and the interest and behavioral pattern of major actors regionally and internationally, as well as locally, of course. There is a great deal that we do know about the causes and dynamics of the current stalemate. I'll discuss a few of them, including the regime power, the opposition, and regional international relations, quickly to adhere to Bishara's note about not talking too much about these latter issues. We know that the regime continues to hold the upper hand in all the metropolitan cities and most major cities, for the most part, with very few exceptions in the northeast and elsewhere, where battles are raging between ISIS and the Kurds, for instance. The source of the regime's power in terms of human resources remains the large standing army, a powerful set of security apparatuses and their trained officers, and the all-powerful Republican Guard headed by the brother of Bashar Assad, Maher. In addition, we have new groups emerging among supporters of the regime or among those who are loath to see the opposition gain ground. These are increasing in size and are improving in terms of training and slowly arms procurement through official regime and army channels. However, it is difficult to imagine the regime's prowess in isolation from the seemingly constant support from its external, regional, and international allies in terms of arms and sophisticated weapons. Though Iran had played a role early on in providing such support, most of the support and aid now comes from Russia. The Israeli strike last week speaks to one such shipment or transaction set to be headed from the coastal city of Latakia to Hezbollah. Of course, anytime Israel strikes, it's about Hezbollah, and therefore it's okay in US parlance. Opposition power and the opposition. Externally, the civilian opposition of all stripes has become increasingly disempowered, and actually maybe internally as well, as the military conflict rages on at the domestic level. Furthermore, internally, we witness the opposition becoming quickly radicalized and Islamicized in significant dimensions. And this is not a generic Muslim Brotherhood type Islamicization. It is an Al-Qaeda type Islamicization which has now dominated the spearhead of the military opposition, not just to the regime, but to other opposition contenders, including the Free Syrian Army and the Kurds. This is evidenced by recent encroachment of the Islamic State of Iraq into Syria to form ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Sham or Syria. And what complicates the matter further is that even among these groups, differences are stark in terms of organization, goals, and strategy. And perhaps my colleagues later will discuss this in more detail in terms of differences between al-Nusra and ISIS. ISIS, for the record, is considered to be too radical by Al-Qaeda's leaders themselves. According to al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's leader today, ISIS is extreme in its approach and methods and is kind of an image liability. These are my words, the last ones. Besides the fact that this is ironically and alarming, it also speaks to the profound radicalization and transformation of the uprising, which is something that I think we should take note of in a very serious way. Today, we are witnessing a three-way conflict between the regime and all the opposition forces that oppose it, with some interesting alliances actually between the regime, or partnerships or deals between the regime and these very opposition forces. That's one. Another is between the forces that oppose the regime generally, and then finally between the Kurds and various segments of the opposition. I'd like to stop here and hope that my colleagues will address this in the next panel. Regional and international relations. I will not belabor the point, but the stalemate we are witnessing today is pretty much supported by the balance of power regionally and internationally. There seems to be a consensus, unspoken, regarding not pushing full force to topple the regime. This consensus is forged principally at the international level between Russia and the United States, and although it goes through ups and downs, the basic motive is not to create a certain kind of spillover effect that undermines the interest of either country. The details can be interesting, but they are governed by this dominant concern. The other side of the external equation is regional. On that front, we have a stalemate in terms of support for the regime and the opposition. On the one hand, Iran and Hezbollah are active supporters of the Syrian regime in terms of funds, logistics, weaponry training, and actual involvement in the field of battle, whether or not the latter is consistent or a late arrival. It is also important that there are growing regional concerns about the radicalization of the uprising and the potential consequences that flow from a takeover of ISIS-like groups. Chief among the concerned governments is that of Iraq, of course. Otherwise, we also do see a different regional attitude about the uprising when it comes to Arab publics, as evidenced by traditional and new social media. Whereas sympathy for the opposition was more broadly and more enthusiastically exhibited during the first half of the uprisings, today we see more and more skepticism about the opposition in its more extant form, or at least about dominant aspects of the military opposition. Still, the attitude shift refers mainly to the opposition. Few have changed their minds about the necessity of change in Syria or the brutality of the regime, which over the past 40 or 50 years, one can argue that the almost total dominance of the regime in Syria makes it, whatever your position is on external intervention, on Israel, on Hezbollah, on Allah, on whatever you want to think about, the regime is the main party that is responsible for everything that is happening today in Syria. It did not have to be this way. When you have complete control, you could have actually done otherwise in the years or decades prior to the interference of all these forces that we say are very problematic, and they are. The question is what kind of change and how for Arab publics in the region. The question is, and of course for many Syrians, the question is what kind of change and how would it take place? And increasingly, at what expense and with what consequences? Intended or not, all this has lent more negative credibility to the regime. The regime wins when there is some force that ultimately happens to support the status quo, and the status quo is one where the regime is alive. On the other hand, support for the opposition has begun early on from various regional neighbors, starting with Turkey, who seemed to misjudge the time it would take to topple Assad, and thus went after the regime full force, despite differences within the Turkish government. More consistently, the support of the opposition in various forms has been coming from conservative Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who themselves diverge on some issues but share the broader concern with marginalizing and or overthrowing the Syrian regime. This support occurred at various levels, from funding and weaponry to actually facilitating or actually sending fighters and potential fighters to Syria. I have argued during the past 2.5 years that the regional role in undermining the collective action potential of the opposition as a whole cannot be underestimated, and we can discuss this further in the Q&A. In the interest of keeping to the words of and the limit of our host, I will jump to sort of a conclusion where I will talk very quickly about some of the lessons learned, which is an abridged set, and that's for me primarily. And clearly everything that I say and everything that all my colleagues will say on Syria is infinitely or can be infinitely contested and disputed, and this is just the way Syria politics is right now. And what matters, at least analytically, is the staying power of some of our analysis. It's always good to go back a few years and see what people who are speaking now said then, and then to look at the transformation. And that's usually a good measure of who you're listening to. I will start with what we have learned about our ignorance, especially in reference to the first year and a half of the uprising. So first, we learned that we really did not know much about Syria prior to March 2011, that most of us woke up to Syria only then and tried to fit it in and its regime in a template that kept rejecting it. Thus, much of the analysis prior to winter of this year was still betting on the fall of the regime somehow. But the history of modern Syria, especially under the Ba'ath Party, started decades before. Even today, our analysis continues to be pegged on the daily developments at the expense of the big picture. And I might differ slightly with Bshara on the question of whether the resilience of authoritarianism in Syria is still significant. I actually feel that the past several years attest to the fact that the resilience is justifiable as an analytical description, in the sense that first of all, the Syrian regime was resilient for 4 to 5 decades, even before the question of the uprising, and throughout the uprising, even if through external support, you can't take resilience, you can't divide things up. The resilience also is a function of relations and external relations at that. So this becomes an important issue, if less important in the past in the past few months. I have 3 more minutes, and I'll keep to my time. We learned that we also stopped paying attention to what is going on in Iraq after 2008, partly because it was off mainstream news, partly because of trouble at home here in the United States, and partly because of the withdrawal of US troops. Thus, many are taken aback by the recent encroachment of ISIS, for instance, or Islamic State of Iraq, and it reveals how much we were following what's happening in Iraq. And of course, our media is responsible for that. Mainstream media. Third, we have also learned that we were too skeptical of the early critiques of the early interference of countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey and the United States in the affairs of the opposition and the emerging rebel groups inside Syria. So whenever someone would be skeptical about this interference and its problematic consequences, we would be too skeptical about this critique, and I think that was a big mistake, even if those who were being skeptical overshot. 4, we also learned that imperialism is alive and well. Many will say whatever that means, but it means a lot, especially if you don't push the argument too far. It means that the attempt by major international and regional forces or their local allies to establish domination, if not hegemony, over a resource-rich region like the Middle East is central to unfolding events. How we make or ascertain these connections can be sloppy, which we have seen. But ignoring them because the maximalist version is unappealing is an egregious, not just sloppy mistake. 5, and my last point, the last learning moment I wish to share is again that the Syrian regime was able to preserve or persevere, even if already clobbered, by letting its opponents fall into internal conflict or create that internal conflict on the one hand, and by having its people scared to hell of the alternative. The players involved on the other side, notably the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, are making it much easier for the Syrian regime not just to survive, but to ameliorate its image given the alternatives. So we are still in a stalemate in Syria, one that started about a year and a half into the uprising. And there are 2 differences. I'll close with these. First, the entrenchment is much, much, much deeper, and we can unpack that. Second, it will take a dramatic action as a result to change the existing balance of power. If the existing balance of power is claiming thousands of lives, injuries, and displacements per week, such action, international military action, for instance, would be even more devastating, especially in the short run, and especially for Syrians and others, apparently, which is why it's off the table. There is no clean solution to this ongoing tragedy. A military solution might end the war, but not the conflict. As unlikely as it is, only a political solution can benefit not just Syrians today, but Syrians tomorrow. Now it is a matter of finding out who really cares about Syrians to affect such an outcome. That's it. Thank you.
Well, the task falls to me to offer some discussion at this point. I can really identify with Alia Malek's. Sorry?
Should they sit at the panel for discussion?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes, that'll be fine. That'll be great.
Shall I continue from where I am?
Please.
Okay.
Or at the table with us.
I'll just continue from where I am, and then I'll join the parties at the table. I was just about to say, Alia, that I could identify with your feeling of inadequacy, perhaps not for the same reasons. I'm quite at home amongst Middle East studies geniuses, but I don't know a whole lot about Syria. Tragedy, just unrelenting human suffering, just mindless, irrational loss, lose, loss. And I'm in a discipline, economics, where we pride ourselves on applying the presumption of rational calculation to giving an account of human behavior, but I don't see the rational calculation here. The inadequacy of our tools as social scientists for measuring human welfare when set against such an extreme context of loss. We can count, okay? We can estimate. I don't object to Alex's, sort of baseline assumption that the economy would continue along like this, and then an effort to measure a gap and to sum it up. I don't object to that. But it occurs to me that it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the loss here. And indeed, there's a kind of arrogant presumption, I don't mean to attribute that to you personally, to we analysts to think that we could quantify and set one against the other. I mean, what about fear? What about despair? What about grief? What about hopelessness? What measure are we going to put on that? So I'm humbled. I was also thinking as I listened about recovery, and perhaps it's a bit premature to even speak in these terms. No one seems to be able to see the end of conflict. Conflict will be going on for some time, I'm told. We need a political resolution, but no one has said exactly what that would be or how it would be arrived at or how it could be enforced and sustained. But the time will come for rebuilding, and as I was doing my economist critical assessment of, well, how would you measure, one of the things I thought was short-term and steady state. Short-term, what's happening right now, what's the loss in GDP, unemployment, years of school not completed today, versus what are the implications of the events today for the long-term trajectory of this system? Where will it settle in? I mean, there's a way in which you could say the clean slate effect and the possibility of reorganization could, over a very long term, lead to outcomes that would be regarded as better than what otherwise might have happened. I hesitate even to go down that road because it seems all too just formalistic, but it does make me think at a conceptual level, well, if I'm trying to measure and assess here, I don't want to just think about what's happening now. I want to think about the whole dynamic structure of interaction and recovery, reconstruction, whatever that might be, wherever those funds might come from, who would be engaged in it, in the international community and so forth, and what the opportunities are, would have to be a part of the story. It seems to me we're going to do this right. But I tell you that hypothetical, that kind of thought experiment, well, what's the steady state here? What are the long-term implications? Strikes me as fanciful in the face of the just overwhelming, unrelenting weight of loss. So there's the how do you put a price tag point. How do you put a price tag on the human dimensions of what's taking place? There's also, in my mind, again, as I sit here, and I will be brief, because I think this convocation has a good deal more to learn from those who've gone before than they do from me. I can't help but think about my responsibilities as a citizen of the world and also as a citizen of the United States, my political responsibilities. This is not my fight. I'm not directly implicated, and I could go on in my life without thinking again about this. But it's been intimated, and I think it will be suggested further in the deliberation, that international actors in the United States of America, and our allies are prominent amongst them, not responsible for the conflict, but certainly entailed by it, having interest in it, making decisions that influence it. And I just wonder if it's good enough to be sitting on the sideline. And I'm just wondering if a claim of ignorance or no direct interest entailed or not my fight suffices in the face of the moral challenge. I think not. I think one has to find a way of taking a stand. I think that one has to be a critical voice. And I think I'll be able to discharge that function more effectively for having the experience of hearing from the people who've spoken here today. I'm chastened, both as a citizen and as a scholar, chastened by the challenge of what personal responsibility is even at a distance, and chastened by the intellectual realization that the tools of my trade turn out to be not entirely useful in these moments of crisis, and made to think that the quantitative social scientist and the humanists really ought to be having a lot more conversations together, and we shouldn't have to wait for the occasion of war and tragedy for those conversations to take place. Thank you.
The floor is open to discussion. My only role here is just to keep track of the hands that go up so I can go in the order that they go up. So, and I would only ask that you just introduce yourself before you ask your question. So please. Malai?
Hi, my name is Malek. I'm in the anthropology department. I had a question which I think pertained most centrally to Alex's presentation, which was that how I think we're both trying to assess and understand what are some of the current implications. What are some of the current developments that are taking place, but also long-term implications. So I think the most damning statistic was the idea that the levels of destruction we have seen would take 4 or 5 decades to recover at a certain growth rate. I was also wondering, because you referred to this briefly, that there's been a kind of rise in informality and a rise in non-state forms of self-provisioning, and I'm just wondering what are the residues of that in a post-conflict scenario? It's at one level too perverse to talk about a post-conflict scenario because there is none in sight, but to the extent that I think we are talking about a region that has seen conflict in many other countries, some of them, Syria is in the midst of one, Iraq is recovering from one in some senses. There are long-term consequences to also assess, and I was just wondering what happens when, since you mentioned the question of sovereignty and the question of states and governments, what happens to the legitimacy associated with governmental services and with states, whether a Bashar regime or a post-Bashar regime, when you have this kind of entry of international actors and all forms of non-state provisioning, and what does that do to the way in which people negotiate and their sense of entitlement to certain forms of services and basic needs?
Yes, shall I answer?
Yes.
Yeah, I think in the context of informality, and you can look around the globe, look at India, look at Bangladesh, there you have massive informality and people have no sovereignty. They have no resources, they have no function of the state, they have no leverage on the state. So the more people are informalized, the less agency they have as political actors in the big picture. I think that's the main issue. From my point of view, I'm by academic training, I'm a sociologist, but by my work, I'm a bureaucrat working on development assistance. And so we look at these things, I think, more from a practitioner perspective. And before I came here, I was meeting with the US State Department. And it's very clear that there's a significant change in the way that the US State Department and its agencies are thinking about the situation in Syria today. And I think my perception from being there and talking to them, that the way in which they're looking at it is anti-Iraq. Everything we've done in Iraq was wrong, from breaking up the institutions, the Ba'athist organization, whether it was the banks, whether it was the education, whether it was the healthcare system, that they know was the wrong approach, and I think that's why the position is slowed down. So I think, again, it's the nature of the settlement that will actually determine how things move. Now, the thing about 5% growth in 3 decades to get back to, that's a sort of glib sort of economist trick. When, if there is a real reconstruction, there will be billions of dollars coming in very rapidly. So the rate of growth, it won't take so long, it won't take 30 years to get back there. But the nature of where it goes, that's a debate that perhaps many Syrians will be excluded from, because it will be done by large multinational actors. Clearly the sort of national socialism of the Ba'ath Party is not going to be a party to that discussion, or there will be groups wishing to make that, but it will be more or less, I think, in terms of the power and hegemony on that, it will be more or less a neoliberal agenda that will be set for the future of Syria. And that, I mean, for my particular focus, is the wrong agenda.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's the wrong agenda.
Can you move your microphones closer to you, maybe? So this will be recorded, and we want to make sure the audience who downloads this later will be. Yes?
Yes, Anna. Bassam, many people who argue that, or many people who believe that the solution has to be a political one, as I do, are also opposed to internationalization, as I am, and as many people are. But and so we find ourselves stuck in a position where we're waiting for the conflict to end for a political solution to emerge. Whereas we look at the history of conflict in this specific part of the region, we often find that it actually takes a political solution or political initiative to bring the conflict down to a level where we can then start actually talking about a political solution. So there has to be a kind of push before there is a push in order to actually make that seeable, as it were. So how do you, what do you think about, how do you walk the line between believing that that the solution has to be political and feeling that internationalization can be very damaging to the situation?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the $1 million question. I don't know. I really don't know. All I know is that this other potential solution is a no-go, and if that's one's position and they can't present a better alternative, it doesn't mean that this position is wrong. I could be just stupid or unable to come up with or not stupid, as in I don't want to make fun of stupid things and people, but I could be just not smart enough to come up with a reason, and for me that's sufficient. It's like asking, so you don't like America's capitalism, what do you want, so the Soviet Union, or I don't know, but I just think we can do better. So having said that, there are a couple of things that are actually concrete. The regime, those of us who have been following the regime, and including those who haven't, they probably know that the regime will not just step down. They would rather, they have a scorched earth policy, and it's very real, it's very concrete, in the sense that they will take the conflict wherever they need to before making a step to step down. The opposition is also today an issue. Why? Because there's no opposition per se. There are many oppositions that within themselves are actually not able, even within the group, for instance, Jabhat al-Nusra, it doesn't have a unified voice regarding all matters itself. So you don't have the very basic elements, in my view, of a traditional political solution. What unfortunately might have to happen is a kind of event, or a kind of I don't know what, some sort of a fundamental change that will convince all players that this is actually what needs to happen. On the one hand, basically a political solution, and on the other hand, the major forces internationally and regionally would have to be convinced of this. In my view, the United States is not interested in stopping the conflict, because as far as I'm concerned, in my analysis of the United States position and, say, Israel's position, to them what is happening now is like a wet dream. You have Assad, I'm sorry. You have Assad and the Ba'ath Party and the Syrian military fighting Islamists of a certain variety, with Hezbollah also in on the fight, depleting its resources. So the resources of all these groups are now being depleted, and the potential military prowess of Syria as Syria, not Syria as Ba'ath or Syria as Assad, is declining. I think it's actually something that, from a crude and rational perspective of or rational quotation marks, limited rationality of these parties, I think what's going on is actually, it's good to prolong it as far as these actors are concerned. And if a change needs to happen, it needs to have the support of Russia, the United States, and in my view, Iran. And I don't think at this point it's likely because Iran is now also thinking about other things, including the nuclear issue. And I think the victim here is the Syrian people, and that's the tragedy that I can't even intellectually express.
Okay, I see Nancy, I see you, and then I see Riva, please.
Hi, Nancy Kalick. I teach religious studies
Hi,
here.
Ms. Woltich.
Hi, Nancy Kalick. I teach religious studies here. And I have a question for any of the panelists, and I'm not sure if it's answerable, but in the conversation, it sounds like there is a certain rational agency attributed to at least the external powers that are seeing some benefit for their own interest in allowing the conflict to continue. But the voices I hear tend to also characterize the internal agents as completely irrational. And I guess I'm just wondering, in this upwards of 1,000 armed militias, what are their calculations? What is their perspective in terms of their own ability to accomplish anything? Because we can't just say the outside folks are acting rationally and cynically and coldly, but everybody there is acting irrational. So what is your view of that?
Maybe Alia can take a stab at this.
I mean, I think when it comes to embracing, I think some people embrace violence not necessarily as an end, but I mean the means itself is the end. These are people who have been, even for people who are not involved directly in violence, you're sort of living in Syria. There's you're constantly being threatened by the regime, just even in being forced to act as if everything is normal. That is a sort of violence that's being perpetuated against you. And I think the way trauma works is that there are a lot of people embracing violence, not necessarily with any sort of goal in mind. I think just there's something, I don't know, cathartic, or it seems like they're able to exercise agency if they participate in that manner. For the when you go to the so-called liberated North, I mean, that's a lot more, I guess, I'm not a theorist of rationality and irrationality, practitioner of irrationality maybe more than anything else, but I think, it makes some sense for people who had no kind of power before or wealth before to now have power and wealth, even if it's in a limited region, even if it doesn't mean ultimately being able to stretch that across, having power over the entire territory that is Syria or the entire state. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's how it looks like from my perspective.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say with regards to we shouldn't assume that the ideal situation would be a political solution to this, but we shouldn't assume that necessarily will happen, and we should also not assume that a military solution is not possible for one side or the other, because the balance forces change quite dramatically. And if you actually look at the numbers in terms of deaths of soldiers and death of the defense forces, we're talking about a very significant number. There's a recent activity from the Minister of Defense was to create income generation activities for the families of martyrs, of soldier martyrs who've been killed or were missing. And that number is 28,000 deaths. There's also, and that does not include the National Defense Forces, which people estimate to be even higher, up to as much as 50,000. So there's already been a significant number of deaths on the Syrian military side. That, and I assume there's some knowledge of that on the opposition side, which would give them some feeling that in some way they were prosecuting something quite successfully. Now, I don't know if that's delusional or not, but there's certainly a rationality behind what they do. And we can already see that the sophistications, the weaponry of the opposition is getting much more sophisticated than it was a year ago. So the types of armaments they're getting are a higher caliber and a better quality. So I think it's rather glib of us to dismiss the prospect of a military solution in the future. That's possible. I mean, I don't think it's desirable, but I think it's possible.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't know who mentioned anything about irrationality of local actors. I mean, the question was the only discursive statement that actually mentioned it. So nobody's assuming that. The reason I discussed external rationality and prolonging the conflict is because it's such a crude and cruel thing, but it's not just out of cruelty, it's out of interest. Clearly the local players, whether the myriad opposition forces, are pursuing their own self-interest, however problematic that might be. I mean, all actors can have problematic self-interests. Hezbollah is pursuing its self-interest because if Syria falls, there will be consequences to Hezbollah that are not desirable from their perspective. And the regime, perhaps the regime can actually be faulted for not, not looking ahead. But there we are assuming that the regime cares about Syria or for instance, let's say the Alawites, okay, to get a bit sectarian. But that's an assumption, and I think it's a faulty assumption. So there's no shortage of rationality, and I'm not going to debate the concept of rationality here or bounded rationality.
I
But
was really just actually inserting that because of from the comment about the sort of the senselessness of the loss. I wasn't saying that you said they
cool.
were rational.
Okay, cool. Now, as far as the political solution or the military solution being dismissed, I never dismissed a military solution. I just expressed my desires and my estimation of what would be less catastrophic. So the issue remains that every single player in this conflict, locally, regionally, and internationally, seems to be contributing to a more of a lockdown of the current situation. And I just don't see, as I shared earlier, a way out, including military intervention, because there's very little interest in doing it, at least not doing it now, except some sort of unanticipated event. It could very well be a strike against Israel, for instance, somehow, somewhere. It could very well be something that emanates out of Turkey or even Iran or from within Syria. But it's very difficult to imagine a military solution today because of the perceived interest of these groups and parties. And it's also difficult to imagine a political solution because you actually need parties to come together, and I think those parties themselves do not constitute like a unitary agency.
Tom?
Yes. My name is Tom Lazier. I'm a Syrian American whose family's been here since early 1900s. I studied at the American University in Beirut and traveled to Syria many times. One of the things that disturbs me as a Syrian Christian, but as an American, is that the way our country has acted toward this crisis and the information that the media has presented the world, which has been unfactual and biased in many respects. I have family still in Syria who are under siege every day, who've had to leave, as you've mentioned, as the Armenians have, and years ago, Syrian Christians during that time of the Ottoman Turks left, and they are leaving now to Sweden and other countries. But our foreign policy has been critical of Syria. I look at this young lady in the back of her jacket has axis of evil. And I remember President Bush calling Syria as one of the axis of evil and a continual perpetuation of an evil power in Syria. I think that after Hafez Assad died and the president went to the funeral, there was a time that America could have stepped forward and filled the vacuum in Syria and bring the country along, but it did not do that. And what's happening now through the media, which has kind of backed off a little bit and been becoming a little more factual in its broadcasting, but the situation in Syria, I agree, is not going to be solved militarily because neither side is going to give in. It's going to have to be negotiated. And when have we ever seen that the sensible mind and approach has come from Russia and the president of Russia compared to the United States?
Shall we take that as a comment? Okay. Riva,
Or a question on the media aspect of it also.
do you want to say something, Alia, about the media?
I mean, I'm trying to read between the lines of what you were saying. Listen, I mean, yes, everyone thought that when Bashar al-Assad, I mean, he's goofy looking. His wife is super quote unquote modern. She dresses well. She speaks with a British accent. But this idea that, I mean, and the U.S. actually was trying to sort of, with its wooing courtship of Assad via Turkey before 2011. I think the U.S. was sort of trying to pursue other policies to supposedly win the Assad regime into its corner. But I think we've seen even before this uprising, in the 11 years of Bashar al-Assad's rule, I mean, he wasn't particularly interested in reform. He wasn't particularly interested in doing, economic reform. Okay, building the Four Seasons and bringing Coca-Cola and modern cars into Syria is one metric of modernity, but people were dissenters were still being locked up. Any civil society initiative that started was, very quickly, if not disbanded, co-opted by the government and by the First Lady's foundation. Any idea, any attempts of building solidarity across the societal lines was very, very much manipulated. So I just think it's misleading to think that it was a failure, that somehow, but for more U.S., the U.S. being nicer to Bashar al-Assad, that he would have not turned out to have done what he did. And in terms of, yes, maybe the United States, there's much evil, much good in all countries, and the U.S. sort of picks and chooses who is going to talk about depending on its politics. But there, I just think, I don't believe in this sort of equating the what's going on with opposition forces with what's going on with the regime. I was there. I saw sort of the regime manipulate the situation and create a situation where in this sort of vacuum, these sorts of actors were going to come to the forefront. At the end of the day, even to the Syrians who say, what should the deal? What's the exchange? What would be better? I would say, he was the president of a country. I mean, his responsibility was not to allow the country to descend into the situation that it's in, even if he was looking for an ex posto sort of justification for why he should be in power. I mean, the buck has to stop there. And I just think that he's revealed himself to sort of be very much his father's, the son of the Assad kind of rule, and I don't think there was other actions that the United States, I think they kept trying to offer him an opportunity to save face. I mean, his pursuit of the policies that he did was, was very much were his choices.
Riva.
Hi, my name is Riva. I have a question, I guess. And forgive if this is coming from a place of ignorance. I don't know too much about the situation, but I guess we've been hearing a lot about how if the U.S. had done something earlier, or if the international community had done something earlier, it wouldn't have gotten to this point of radicalization. And I'm curious about the process of radicalization in Syria at this moment. This idea of active versus passive radicalization. Could you either, Bassam or Alia, could you speak on how we've heard a lot about foreign fighters coming in, but how the process of radicalization has occurred for Syrians themselves, or to what extent this is occurring, and whether there could be a de-radicalization, or whether this process could move in reverse?
I can try to address this, although I think our next panel has a lot of things to say about this, especially that one of the panelists was actually in Syria and kind of saw this firsthand. I just want to start by saying that the radicalization in Syria early on did not take place simply because Syrians were just had an affinity with the radicalization or Al-Qaeda or anything of the sort. I think we now forget, unintentionally of course, that in the first few months or first 2-3 months of the uprising, people were, even if they had problematic ties, but people were being faced with bullets right from the start. And that in and of itself, I think, has a tremendous impact on radicalization. And that, of course, never stopped. But then when the conflict became militarized on all sides, it became more complex, and it wasn't just about that. Of course, external interference took what could naturally develop and magnified it into something much larger, because you can be radical, but if you don't have money and weapons and food and something to offer communities, you're not going to be able to stand up. And that's where countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar came in. But we can't just lay blame on the outside and not consider what the regime has done from the very beginning. You also have something very natural, common, and maybe human, and that is, if you want to fight today, and perhaps the panelists in the next panel can address this. If you want to fight today in Syria, and you need weapons, most likely those weapons are going to come from Jabhat al-Nusra type or ISIS type groups, not from other sources. So if you want to fight today and you're resisting getting weapons, support, and logistics from such groups, you can resist for some time, but eventually people are giving in and are joining, not necessarily because they believe in the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, but because of the these conditions. So that plays also a major role. And again, the emphasis, I think, in conflict historically, we have learned that the emphasis should be placed on funding and on support from the outside. This is what actually magnified what we are seeing today. And then in terms of what we have heard from the beginning, that the United States could have done this or could have done that, why are we assuming the United States wants anything other than what we are witnessing today? I don't assume that. I think the external players, especially Turkey, early on, but also Saudi Arabia and Qatar, played a very destructive role in simply pursuing their own interests at the expense of, quote unquote, the opposition, and have actually undermined the possibility, even if this possibility wasn't going to topple the regime without problematic external interference, but they undermined the possibility of the opposition inside and outside Syria, especially outside Syria, coming together as a unit of sorts, and there are documentations of this. But I really think that it's important to also look at the time frame. The Egyptian uprising and the Tunisian uprising, and perhaps others, with the exception of Libya, were short-lived. And I'm not sure if they lasted for a much longer period, I'm not sure they would be radically different, although they probably will be different, because Syria is at the intersection of so many conflicts, local, regional, and international. But the time horizon here is actually an important factor that we don't discuss. We just assume that what we are seeing is just a function of things Syrian, or things that have to do with the question of radicalization, but it's also that this is not anymore just about Syria.
Maysoon.
I have a question.
Ali Sultan.
I have a question to Alex. I think there is also a war on statistics in Syria. So the government is always trying to lessen the number, and then you have the anti-Syrian regime who are trying to really raise them. And I was intrigued because you have, especially when it comes to the loss of the economy, I read some statistics that were like almost 5 times more than what you mentioned. Well, since you are a sociologist, and I know you know that the GDP or all these numbers are very misleading, like beyond the war of statistics. I was wondering if you have any insights on who are the new classes that are formed in Syria now, and then especially when you talk about consumerism and you say that the consumerism dropped by 42%. I mean, before the war, before the revolution, there were 40% of the Syrian people were living under poverty. So who is affected by this consumer? This is just one example. And also, like, from what you have seen on the ground, who do you think is going to be, like how are the classes formed, especially like who is benefiting from the war economy and so on. And the second question would be is, you mentioned that the State Department are doing the opposite of what they have been doing in Iraq. How much is that learning, and how much is that because of their interest in Syria is different from their interest in Iraq? Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Alex, you have two tough questions. Bring the microphone closer to you. Class analysis, please.
I'll leave the class analysis to the second, if you don't. Look, the statistics, I think, look, you can always argue about statistics. What we're doing, what the Syria Center for Policy Research are doing, they're basically working on projections. They're not 100% accurate. But they're also based on discussions with experts. So it's not just they're not just taking statistics from government. They're taking statistics from government, but they're trying to triangulate them from experts and also do basic case studies on the ground to see if the data makes sense. Now, yeah, there is a war in statistics. Both sides want to create arguments. Statistics help people make arguments of certain kinds. So I think that's going to go on. What the Syria Center for Policy Research is doing is trying to make sure it doesn't support either party. And I think that's the important thing. They're trying to maintain an independent, objective assessment of the situation in as much as that is possible. So I think that's important. So we can argue about that, but my own view is, based on what we have done in Palestine in the past during different conflict situations, that these are as good a numbers as you're going to get from anywhere. So, and also there's other research that's been done that is complementing that. The work of ESCWA basically is coming to very similar conclusions.
Explain ESCWA that everybody here knows.
Yeah, ESCWA is the Economic Commission for Southwest Asia, if I'm not mistaken,
yes.
Which is similar to ICLA in Latin America. So they're working on similar sets of statistics, and we're not very far apart on that. In terms of class structuration, the nature of the economy is changing very dramatically. Deindustrialization means that the whole of the working class sector is now unemployed. We don't know how that's going to be. We can see what happened in Europe and America with deindustrialization. You have people, families, households, communities that disintegrate very rapidly over time and don't find ways to reconstitute themselves because there's no money, there's no investments to actually renew job opportunities. I think that's going to be a very difficult thing. Also, Syria still has one of the biggest peasantries in the Middle East, so that is a survival instrument that will help certain communities survive in the future. They're going to be very poor, but they have instruments and means to actually sustain themselves through agriculture, through an agricultural resource base. But also, agriculture is also suffering from some of the same forces that are linked to deindustrialization. Agriculture has been resources, animals have been looted, stolen. There's a lot. So I think for me the big thing is there's a huge amount of lawlessness, and the militias are part of the rapaciousness of lawlessness. I think this is not widely recognized, but part of the losses and destruction of the economy is coming for people taking funds for short-term gains, whether that's to prosecute the revolution or not. It's part of the process. So you're building within those so-called revolutionary forces elements that actually do not look very progressive for the future. Now, I think the issue of what the regime is and what I don't think you could. I don't like to measure the regime. I don't like to say the regime is better than the opposition, but you have to say that both forces are deeply problematic. And if we take sides on either one, like the media did at the beginning of the struggle, the media basically misread the situation dramatically. It believed its own illusions. And it was only recently that they've actually began to actually be more objective and more understanding in the nature of the conflict. And I think one of the big factors in that was the rise of jihadist forces into the country. That made them take a different focus on it, and that made it different from Iraq. If the jihadists hadn't been there, we would have been in an Iraqi situation today. That I feel very strongly. But I think the class structure is going to change dramatically, but we don't know how it will change. There are no, I think, the traditional business class is in significant demise. It's essentially been bankrupt. Whether they can get the resources together in any period of reconstruction to reconstitute themselves remains to be seen. But we're a long way from reconstruction at the moment.
Can I say something about
Sure.
the class structure? You know, and as Maysoon, I'm sure you know well, the class structure in Syria, you know, went through phases. In post-colonial times, we had a gradual increase of the middle class as a function of the expansion of the public sector and urbanization and modernization and so on. And then as the public sector started, on the one hand, to falter, as the regime started to basically became entrenched and became a bit more predatory about the economy, and so on and so forth, we began to see a shift in the political economy of Syria away from a state-centered economy, along with the broad de-industrialization taking place elsewhere, and began to actually shift alliances from labor to business in such a manner that beginning in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, until 2010, we saw a dramatic shrinking of those classes or strata in the middle of the socioeconomic ladder. And we began to see polarization on two fronts. First, between the haves and the have-nots. However cliche this sounds, it's actually true. And then we began to see another kind of polarization that's regional, in the sense that everything was poured into the urban areas and the city, and the countryside was neglected. And that's a regional and international pattern, which explains to a large extent the reason why the uprising actually started and continued to be very much of a rural affair or small city affair in Syria, as opposed to starting in Damascus or Aleppo. And that is the case, of course, in Tunisia as well. And to an extent in Egypt, we became aware, or many became aware of the uprising in Egypt when it reached Tahrir Square, but things started earlier in Ismailia and Port Said and elsewhere. So I just wanted to add this dimension because it actually speaks what I keep saying in a lot of the Syria discussions, that what we are seeing in Syria today, this loss that people like you and me and others, I don't know if you want to be in my category, we know what we like and support and want around questions of social justice and so on, but there doesn't seem to be an institution or a party or an actor that represents that route. And this is, I think, a global condition. And I think we find it in the United States, whereby a good number of people do not find institutional representation for their preferences. And maybe that's more than what you intended to ask about, but I'll stop.
Yeah. Suddenly, we have too many questions. I think Linda was next, and then you are, and then Shiva, and then you. And I think we'll have to stop there because we have to be properly finished at 3.
A question for anyone, but particularly Haddad. I take your point that the U.S. and everyone else doesn't really have an interest in ending this conflict, but still, I want to ask a kind of hypothetical question. So when this Syrian conflict began, people pointed to Iraq and said international intervention never works, it only makes things worse. But that's not always true. If we look, for example, at NATO intervention in the Yugoslav Civil War, particularly I think of Bosnia, intervention did work. NATO intervention created a sort of herding stalemate, which political scientists often see as one of the conditions that leads to and forces political negotiations and solutions. And after the intervention, we did get a political solution. It was flawed. It rewarded the aggressor as Milosevic sat at the table, but still the violence stopped. And so I wonder, does any of you think that if there had been an international intervention early on that produced something like a herding stalemate between the regime and the opposition, that might have produced a political solution before the radicalization of the opposition?
Do you want to take more questions, or do you want to?
No, go ahead on that one.
Does anyone want to say something?
I mean, I just think intervention doesn't only mean military intervention. There are several steps that could have been taken initially by bringing everybody to the table. And, you know, Bashar is still, I mean, the regime is able to stay in power because of the support of Russia, Iran, and China. If a conversation had, if there were an intervention that sort of negotiated those interests. So I'm not sure, is your question only about military intervention?
Well, it's military intervention has sometimes worked. If we can produce something of the conventional wisdom on political scientists that is as long as one side assumes it can win, is not likely to give up. It is only when neither side believes it can win that we get negotiations. It's what ended the conflict in Ireland. It's what ended the conflict in Bassam.
But there's international law dimensions to this intervention. Intervention in Balkans was based on humanitarian principles, where there was no state structure. Whether people like it or not, the Syrian government is still a member state in the UN, and any intervention at this time is in breach of international law unless it's mandated by the UN. So I think that principle of international law is fundamental to the law of wars. And if Western governments breach that based on humanitarian interventions, then we've undermined centuries of the basis of how states work together and solve problems. And I think that is something that we see failed largely in Iraq. And I think there's, and you could see what happened when it went to parliamentary discussion, particularly in Britain. It failed, and I think that was one of the reasons why we didn't have an intervention at this time, because that whole problem of using the right to protect as a pretext for war creates major problems within the international law framework.
I'll say
Sure.
very quickly. I think international intervention is not like it's not a discrete factor or variable. It's not like you know, if you have a headache, you take an Advil and that deals with it. It's actually something akin to a very potent drug that could actually debilitate or kill you if it's misadministered, or if it's administered to some situation whereby the situation is very complex and involves complications. So I would just focus on the points of my colleague right now, and that is the basis, the motivation for the intervention. And that has a lot to do with it, although historically you point out some good examples that can be debated actually, but in most cases international intervention was actually disastrous. The other point is intervention early. I think one of the problems with international intervention, especially in a place like the Middle East, considering who would intervene, of course, they are part of the problem. So the international intervention would not be based on anything that would actually produce the intended results. And even if a military, quote unquote victory is achieved, it will always be inconclusive and illegitimate because it involves the same players that for many people in the region are part of the problem. Today in Syria or on Syria, many people are not happy or loathe or despise the regime and the regime's dictatorship locally, domestically, but they equally despise and loathe the dictatorship of countries like the United States and its local allies over the entire region. I mean, that's how people see things, through the lens of imperialism or otherwise. So in that sense, in this particular case, I think the word intervention doesn't travel well.
All right, Sheila.
I just wanted to offer one of those annoying comments. It's not a question, but a slight corrective to the frequent use of Iran as if it's one unit that behaves the same way over time in Syria, which is just not actually correct. And I think part of the problem is that most of the people who work on Syria either are Arabists or come from security studies, so don't actually know or follow Iran closely. And especially since June, Iran's situation with Syria has changed dramatically. It's the Revolutionary Guard that has a very central role in Iran, and the government of Iran right now is very actively seeking to diminish the power of the Revolutionary Guard. The government in Iran right now is seeking very much to make nuclear deal with the United States to end the sanctions, and they understand very clearly that that means pulling back from their role in Syria. Bashar Assad has become a very unattractive ally. They would be more than happy to have Syria not be a problem that they have to be involved in. Bashar is not the same as Hafez. Rouhani is not the same as Khomeini. It's different from when Hafez al-Assad was Iran's only ally in the Iran-Iraq war. And I think that we need to historicize and actually, give a little bit more complexity when we just throw around Iran as if it has this one singular relationship to Syria. Khalas.
So we'll take that as a comment.
Yes.
Thank you, Shiva.
Thank you.
I think you were next, and then you. First.
Okay. My name is Gondrak. I'm Syrian American. That's why I can't. I'm interested in this topic. Okay. I'm not questioning the statistical figures nor minimizing the enormity of the catastrophe now, but saying that the revolution or what's happening now destroyed the infrastructure in Syria, that can be misleading because the pre-revolution or before 2011, Syria had this infrastructure, but it was dysfunctional. The economy was corrupted. Most of the economy was run by Bashar's cousin. So that can be, it's not a question, but it can be misleading to the people of not familiar with this, which is by itself, it's a reason why what happened. It's not Syrians just like to imitate their Egyptian cousins and brothers or Tunisian ones.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not underestimating the corruption within the regime, but it was not a kleptocracy. I mean, there was independent businesses operating there. The Armenian business community is one example of independent business. There was a lot of state industry that was not financing the family of the regime. I mean, look, when we take sides on these matters, we look to. I don't have a dog in this fight in any side, right? I'm Scottish. I try and look at the situation as I see it, right? Now, of course, the regime is corrupt. The family of the regime has benefited greatly, but there's no comparison between what happened in Iraq with Saddam Hussein or what happened in Egypt under the regime there, or even in Tunis, right? It's a very different thing. Yeah, there's corruption within the regime, but even within the regime, there are actually very progressive forces. Just as within the opposition, there are also progressive forces. It's not a case of, the problem, again, the issue is if we start to look at these things in some sort of Manichaean way, then we cannot find a solution. We actually people have to come together. And if you talk to Syrians today, and I go to Damascus, I go to Latakia, I go to Coutts, I'm talking to people, okay, people will say, right here and now, they'll say, he's going to Latakia, he's going to Coutts. So, but when you talk to ordinary people, they want an end to the conflict. They want some negotiated solution. They want change. They want change. And change will bring about a change in the regime. They want Assad to go, but if the opposition said a condition for the change must be that Assad goes, then there will be no change because you can't go to negotiation with dictates. You actually have to create a process that leads to a solution that will benefit the Syrian people. And that's why I think it's very important we actually try and empathize with both sides, not just with one side or the other. We have to see where are the good and bad on both sides and try and bring that together. Now, for example, look, I looked at what the opposition is producing today in terms of documents for the future. The one big report that brought out, authored in Ottawa, it's completely insubstantial. It goes back to talking about reintroducing the 1954 Constitution, which really never took place to begin with. So there's a lot more work that the opposition has to do to actually send a message to the Syrian people that they could be trusted in a negotiation process. People don't necessarily trust the regime. They trust aspects of it, but not all of it. So I think we have to move on from this and not just say, yes, there's corruption. course, there's corruption in American polity. There's corruption in British polity. Look at Tony Blair, for example. I mean, just look at the wealth he took over a very few years of being in office. So these issues are one thing important. Petty corruption at any level will exist in every state. We have to get beyond that.
Please.
Yeah, Bassam mentioned the rural versus the urban issues, and I heard that water was a big issue for the rural folks that contributed a big part to this problem, and that the problem was development. From the farmers' point of view, development was taking over the water that they really needed for their situation. Is there any truth to that?
I'll just add to that. There's a lot of people talking about the drought that took place before, and the environmental climatic changes that tipped the situation. Can we talk about that? Maybe Bassam and then Alex?
Yeah, I mean, even before the uprisings in 2009-10, I actually wrote a piece on the impact of the drought and the scant rainfall from 2003 on, and how it caused the displacement of more than 1 million people. I mean, there are no exact figures, but it is more than 1 million people as a result of that, which actually ended up going in the past 8 or 9 or 10 years to other parts of Syria, including smaller cities and towns, as well as the larger cities. And one of the reasons why we see this emerging, this rising starting in the countryside, besides the structural reason, is that a lot of these people were not absorbed actually by the smaller cities and the rural areas, whereas they were more comfortably or less uncomfortably absorbed in the metropolitan cities like Damascus and Aleppo, largely because these cities, of course, had a higher standard of living, better infrastructure, better services, and the inflow of capital from Iraq after 2003 into Syria, into particularly Aleppo and Damascus, also helped maintain some modicum of stability in the cities and ability to absorb such displacement. However, in the smaller cities and the rural areas, that actually compounded the problem and produced something that we witnessed. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate what my colleague has said, but I think we must emphasize that, and maybe I misunderstood, we must emphasize that what's been happening in Syria since the late 1980s is much more structural and much more than petty corruption within government that is replicated elsewhere. Clearly, in the United States, there are networks that are just as problematic, and actually, the kind of legally doing their bidding, as we have seen in the $800 billion. What's it called? 800 billion bailout. But in the case of Syria, I think, as is the case with many countries in the developing world, the absence of any kind of checks and balances outside those networks actually compounds the problem. And in the case of Syria in particular, the extent to which the Syrian social structure has changed from the early 1980s to the late 2000s is actually quite dramatic. Still, I do want to just also throw in that for those of you who are assuming that the Syrian uprising was just a natural consequence of these structural issues, it's not the case. In fact, without the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings, I think the Syrian uprising wouldn't have taken place in 2011. There is a lot to say about, comparatively speaking, the leveling egalitarianism in Syria that actually maintained some modicum of stability, and maybe things would have flared up, as I and many of us had assumed they would, but not as early as 2011 without the demonstration or the domino effect. So the Syrian uprising Syria was kind of not altogether ripe for an uprising, which is one of the reasons why it developed in the manner it did.
Adam?
That was just to add to Sam's point that the water situation in Syria was also largely due to government mismanagement of water resources, and also the fact that the Turks dammed the Euphrates. So it wasn't just a natural disaster.
Compounded by mismanagement.
Yeah.
As I don't see it, no, I'm just trying to figure out if somebody hasn't spoken yet. Just 1 second. Well, that includes me. So, do you mind?
Just one, something to address. Besides the human tragedies that have taken place, the destruction of historical sites and antiquities is devastating, and we hear very little of through the media also. Can you comment on that?
Me? I actually think that you hear disproportionate. I mean, whenever statues or relics or historical sites are going to be destroyed, you find a lot more media attention than you would to ordinary people's deaths. Can I say something briefly?
Yes.
I don't think it's taking sides when you point out that the regime had a responsibility to protect the interests of everybody in the country, not just those of a particular family. Because this is, yes, no one has said that certain elements of the armed opposition are not problematic, and in fact the people that started this uprising were not in favor of an armed uprising. But what I'm afraid of, I feel like we're to throw out 3 academic words in 1 sentence. I mean, this like framing of it like this, that both sides are kind of problematic, sort of posits this pre and post the revolution as if like what existed before was unproblematic, and that means I think that'll lead us to push for solutions that will not ultimately be viable. If we do not understand what has happened, if we do not understand how much blood is on certain actors' hands, then we just act like, okay, everybody kind of turned into a giant monster, and now we just have to bring them all to the table and make them calm down. We're not going to push for a solution that'll work. And I mean, if you really care about the Syrian people, you know that the Syrian people want a viable peace, a viable solution, not something where you just sort of calm the situation down long enough, but where there is no accountability. I mean, that's one of the problems that we see next door in Lebanon. And don't forget, the Syrian people have been wedged between Iraq and Lebanon for a long time, and they've been aware of both those situations. And from Lebanon, what I think many people have learned is that a lack of accountability, leads you to this sort of like, Lebanon's always on the verge of the precipice, and I don't think people want it when stability finally comes back to Syria. I don't think, or when peace or whatever, the end of violence, daily violence comes to Syria. I don't think people want to be on the precipice.
I want to.
I just make one point on that. I think any political settlement under the aspects of international law and international humanitarian law.
Could you speak louder?
Right. Any political settlement under will have aspects of international law and international humanitarian law. And there is the ability to hold people accountable for acts done during warfare, right? And that is a standard procedure of any international-based settlement. Now, whether those are prosecuted or not depends very much on the outcome of the settlement. So I think it's not a case of just to bring people to the table does not mean you bring them to the table where they have no responsibility and accountability. The fact of going to an international negotiated settlement means that it has to take place within the international law framework, which should bring some process of accountability and responsibility for actions to account. Now, that in the end becomes a political action, as we see from Africa. It tends to be African dictators that get taken before the International Criminal Court, and very few people who've been involved in criminal activities from the West in terms of prosecutions of war in Iraq and other places. So again, the instruments are there, but whether they're used or not depends on who's holding power and in whose interest it is to do the prosecution.
So may I reserve the last question for me? We'll be finished in just a few minutes. I'm wondering about the question of fragmentation in Syria and how that looks like from the ground. And by fragmentation, I don't mean just in a spatial geographic sense, which is there, of course. We have liberated territories, quote unquote. We have government-controlled territories. We have territories that are front lines and gray areas. And they have seemed to have solidified pretty much along the same map that the French proposed very early on when they tried to divide Syria into 5 different sections. It's incredible how they mesh together into the same exact thing, which suggests that there's also a sectarian fragmentation going on, and no political solution at this point can work without parts of the population feeling that they will not be massacred the next day. But I'm also talking about a social fragmentation of a different sort, and that's the one I'm most interested in asking about. And that is a fragmentation of the class structure of Syria. You can't just talk now about the big major groups that one talked about before 2011. Now you have a situation of leveling that is going on, where you have a former manual labor heading a militia. And you can multiply this by 1,000 examples of how people who were disempowered for a long period of time in a situation where there's no security in the area in which they live took it upon themselves to exert a certain kind of leadership, which then accrues money and then possible funding from the outside. And you have this then a situation where this explodes in 1,000 different points at the same time inside of Syria. And that creates a form of class, social, and spatial fragmentation that didn't exist before. I'm not sure how it can be mapped out. For those of you who are spending time there or in touch with what's happening there, is there any way that we can actually make sense of this kind of fragmentation? Is it taking any kind of a pattern, or can it be, is there a framework for understanding it at all? Anybody?
Can I answer in a quick but particular way, and that is to I would like to say that as part of my research and ongoing observation of the region, particularly Iraq, I just want to say that what is happening in Syria today, however dramatic, I think does not constitute a sort of comparable situation to what happened in Iraq after 8 years of war in 1980 to 1988, and then the international coalition sort of bringing back Iraq to the Stone Age, or not the Stone Age, like a few centuries back in 1991 via the war, and then the 13 or 12 years of the most devastating sanctions in human history, and then 2003 war, which devastated the social fabric of Iraq even further, because the sanctions did that, where people were selling their kidneys and doors. So I really want, and then of course after 2003 it was no picnic at all. Until today we are seeing on a daily or bi-daily basis or weekly basis dozens of people killed. So I still insist until today that as catastrophic the situation is in Syria, I think if things stop today or even in a few months, I think Syria is in a much better shape to regroup compared to Iraq. So I just want to start there, because this is what I know. In terms of what the actual fragmentation, we can see basically, in my view, analytically, the difficulty of pursuing class analysis on its own today, because of what you just said. A truck driver or a person who belonged to the working class is now leading a militia or a group of like 200 people, and is actually thinks in his head that status is actually brought into this. You've got also displacement of people who I don't think will all necessarily go back. If you go to Beirut, if you go to Hamra, you think you're in Hamra in Damascus. There is a Hamra in Damascus. So I do think that there will be difficulties, but I do not yet think that we're at the point where regrouping is going to be disastrous. And I do not believe in fragmentation along the sides of the Alawi enclave. I think all that talk is problematic, as it was in Iraq. So I'm sorry I couldn't answer.
Please, Alex wanted to say something.
No, I mean, I think he's correct. I think that there's wide-scale fragmentation in many places, right? And it cuts across class lines, it cuts across ethnic lines, it cuts across religious lines. But I don't, but whether that's a reversible situation, I don't think it necessarily is, because that type of fragmentation is taking place because of the war and because of the conflict. But I think in any negotiated solution, part of the conflict has to be about reparation and repairing the damage that's been done to bring communities together. But it doesn't look very likely at this point in time. But once there's a settlement process underway, I think new voices will emerge. And don't forget, mass of the population is not involved in the war or the conflict. And there has to be a space for them as political actors in the future. And I believe very strongly that the solution for the future will come for the people, will come from the mass of people who are not actively engaged in the conflict today.
I can't think of a better way to end, actually, on this optimistic note, the first panel session. Thank you so much for coming here.